Well, Hans, we saw an interesting development this week, and what transpired basically was a story on an old name, he who shall not be named, Eric Ciaramella, who served as the whistleblower, so-called whistleblower in the Trump impeachment scandal. And this was a guy back in the day. If you tried to report on him or mention his name, you actually got banned from Twitter for doing so. And the story got a fair amount of reception, which I think is something we're both excited about because it's deserving. I'm glad that people are, finally starting to get a window into some of the larger elements here. Why don't you go ahead and pick it up?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, you say sort of deserving. Of course, the story deserves a lot of attention. One frustrating thing that I felt all week since this happened is we've known all this stuff. It's like reporting something that's 4 years old and making it look like something new. So that's the frustrating part. But there's also the happy part, and the happy part is, reaching a wider audience. When we talk about Ciaramella, and we'll come and recap all the other stuff here in a moment as to why it came up again this week. But I think we just need to rewind even further, not 4 years, but 5 years. Our friend, Fool Nelson, was the one who identified the guy. I mean, he never gets credit for that. He figured it out. He put the puzzle pieces together, and there he is on Twitter. He's a good friend. He's a fantastic guy, but never gets any of the credit. So all of that happened this week kind of just apparently had nothing to do with him, even though he's really at the core of it all because he figured it out. And by the way, he also figured out Steele's supposed sources and so many other things. All right, so why are we here this week talking about Ciaramella? Well, Real Clear Politics ran a story this week about how Ciaramella was involved very intimately in the firing of the Ukrainian prosecutor in that whole saga. And again, we've known all that for at least 4 years. I tweeted about it 4 years ago in very detailed tweets. And so nothing that came out this week is new. But, and I acknowledge I agree with you, this is a good thing. It doesn't really matter whether it's new. The point is that it reaches a wider audience. People are more receptive to it. People now understand it. And that's all good with me. I'm just very happy about that. Now, beyond that, I think there's a few things missing from the discussion this week, which we can, kind of get into. But I think before we get into the whole thing, maybe we should just briefly discuss what it is that Ciaramella did at the time with firing the prosecutor and what's all that about. And I'll just hand it over to you here in a moment. But I'll just start off with Ciaramella was on the National Security Council in the previous administration under Obama. When Joe Biden was vice president. By the way, he got carried over into the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. That to me is just one of those things where anyway, the thing is he was there, and what was known but was reported this week and is now kind of become a big thing again, and as I said, it's a good thing, more people understanding about this and are hearing about this, is that Ciaramella was not only the whistleblower, so-called whistleblower against Trump, but a few years, that was in 2019, but a few years earlier in 2016, he was even in 2015, he was intimately involved in the firing of the prosecutor. We've all seen the tape of Joe Biden bragging about firing the prosecutor. Turns out the prosecutor was investigating Burisma, Hunter Biden's firm. So of course there was always that nexus there. So when it came time to, when the impeachment came along, what are the chances that the person who brings about the impeachment against Trump for wanting to investigate Joe Biden, that was what it was all about. Trump asked the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden. That was the whole thing. What are the chances that the person who is the supposed whistleblower was actually involved in firing the prosecutor and the whole corrupt deal, which Trump wanted to get investigated? I mean, there is no more obvious conflict of interest humanly imaginable than what happened there.
Well, I think that's part of what makes this story so attention grabbing, because the way I look at this, I mean, we can get further into the details of Ciaramella, but the larger aspect here, I've had a theory for a long time. You and I have talked about it. I think we even did a show on it. But, that theory has been that Russiagate, part of the reason for Russiagate, there was the Clinton plan, But ultimately, I think there was a recognition by the establishment, and I'm talking about sort of the nascent Obama administration, the Biden kind of quasi administration, all of these establishment elements that are embedded, like they weren't transitioning out of government just because Obama was leaving, recognized that there was a very real danger of the actions in Ukraine getting exposed and fundamentally casting a bad light on Obama. In other words, Trump coming in, finding out what Biden was actually doing in Ukraine, realizing that he was doing it with the blessing, effectively, of Obama, that Obama had to know everything, and that those actions in Ukraine had to be covered up. And we keep coming back to some of the same parties. You mentioned Ciaramella being involved in the firing of Shokin, and it's this famous email. When we were trying to put all these threads together, we started looking at why did suddenly the Biden administration want to get rid of Shokin? And, it was very strange because we had these positive responses to Shokin from the Biden administration. Victoria Nuland sent a letter to Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador of Ukraine, or rather had Jeffrey Pyatt deliver the letter. And it was a letter of glowing affirmation for what Shokin was doing, saying you're making great strides in terms of dealing with corruption. It was a 2-page letter basically saying you're doing a wonderful job. 3 months later, Shokin is being condemned by Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt. So something changed in that interim, and that was the inflection point which pointed us to be looking at the direction that Hunter was getting from the owners of Burisma, which is where Joe Biden steps in. So in this process, we have this email we have an email chain. And what we're seeing the behind the scenes Biden administration start prepping to fire Shokin before Biden makes this trip in December out to Ukraine. And part of this email chain involves Jeffrey Pyatt, it involves Victoria Nuland, and it involves Eric Ciaramella. And you see the administration starting to suddenly, out of nowhere, reverse course and suddenly create a narrative that Shokin needs to be fired. And in one particular email sequence, you've got Jeffrey Pyatt on the email and you've got Eric Ciaramella on the email. And Pyatt tells everybody on this email chain officially, well, looks like Biden's going to be making a move to fire Shokin. And Eric Ciaramella jumps in and goes, yikes. And why does Ciaramella say yikes? Because he's aware that this is going to set off an entire process. So, and he's aware of what he's seen is that he's seen a shift in the national policy that's being dictated by Biden that was diametrically opposed to what they had before. So I know that's probably overly complicated, but that's how we came into seeing Ciaramella as being part of the process. And again, I'm trying to get back to the larger point that a lot of this is effectively designed. All of these after effects were designed with looking in the mirror and making sure that the things that Biden was doing with Obama's blessing couldn't be uncovered. And that dictated the rest of their actions.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, that's correct. I think what people generally, again, I was surprised that people didn't know about the yikes email when it, came out again this week, 4 years after the fact. But as I said, okay, that doesn't matter. Better late than never. But the other thing I think people are probably not sort of sufficiently aware of is the complete disconnect between U.S. government policy and Biden policy. So it's always been painted in the media as if firing the prosecutor was somehow U.S. government policy. And, as you just laid out, it was the exact opposite. Right. Plus, there is no evidence anywhere that anyone in the U.S. government wanted to fire Shokin, let alone use Shokin as leverage, in terms of loan guarantee and none of that. Shokin was fine. By the way, he'd only been in office for a few months. It wasn't like as if he could sort of do magic or whatever. And you and I have often commented that he, in retrospect, but even at the time, appears to have been one of the very, very, very few actually honest Ukrainians out there, trying to do the right thing. So, of course, Joe Biden comes along and then fires him. And the whole thing that precipitated that was that November 2nd, 2015 email from the head of Burisma board to Hunter saying this guy needs to be fired. He didn't use those words, but he used actually words that were even worse. He said that Burisma's legal problems had to be ended.
Yeah,
put a
and
stop to it.
I just want to jump in here real quick, because one important point
Yeah.
about that email, something that you and I both, I think we tried to make a pretty big point about at one point in time, is the fact that that email wasn't the starting point. If you read that email carefully, what he's really saying is our earlier efforts that we'd already embarked on to sort of stop Shokin from investigating Burisma weren't working. And therefore, we need to up our game. We need to elevate the efforts to silence him. And that's when Joe Biden got pulled in. But they already were trying to silence him.
Yeah, you're so right. And that is such an important point that's often missed as well in all of this. This wasn't out of the blue. The whole point of hiring Hunter was to protect Burisma and Zlochevsky, the owner. That was the whole point. And obviously, they hadn't done well enough because Shokin, after he came in February of 2015, he restarted the investigation into Burisma, which his predecessor had shut down in exchange for a giant bribe. And this is all documented. So Shokin was doing the right thing. And then, and this is so frustrating to retell this story and just this understanding that so many people do not know this story and will never know this story. Especially, half of America will never, ever know this story. It was Joe Biden who obstructed the prosecutor who actually reopened the investigation into Burisma, which his predecessor had shut down. And, you've said this so many times that people like Dan Goldman or whatever, they deliberately conflate Shokin with the predecessor, the bad guy and the good guy, to make Shokin look like the bad guy. It's incredibly just frustrating, just retelling this whole story, thinking about it again, makes me almost angry. And then, we get to Ciaramella. So it's November 2nd, 2015, Hunter gets his orders, get this guy fired. The investigations need to end now, get it done. 2 weeks later, we have an internal document that was released later on from Joe Biden's office, vice president's office at the time, which says Shokin needs to be fired. That's the first time ever that was ever mentioned in any U.S. government communication of any kind. And then a few weeks later, a couple of these Ukrainian prosecutors came over for alleged training. To me, it's just a grift trip, a nice little trip that they get, but whatever, okay? And the State Department set this kind of tone because they excluded Shokin from this trip. So they didn't invite the boss, but they invited the underlings. Obviously, the goal there was to sort of, turn the underlings or, butter them up or whatever. But the underlings didn't know what was going on. And when they arrived in D.C., and this was January of 2016, they were told that Shokin needed to go. And they were just kind of, what? And Ciaramella was the guy who organized the trip. He was there kind of chaperoning Washington, D.C. He was front and center of that entire effort. And we actually know one of the guys who was with the prosecutors on that trip, Andrei Telizhenko is a friend of ours. And he's one of the few honest ones. And because he was there and because he knows about what Ciaramella did, that he chaperoned the whole thing and that he knows what was said at those meetings because he was there, Andrei was there. The swamp, I don't want to say Democrats, the swamp, it was done on Trump's watch. It was done by people like Mnuchin. They shut Andrei down. They sanctioned the poor guy. He did nothing wrong, but they sanctioned him for telling the truth. What he did is he told the truth about things like that meeting with Ciaramella and all those people. And to me, again, that's just something that makes me incredibly angry. But, here we are.
Yeah, and it's just so people kind of have the backdrop. So Biden makes this trip to Ukraine in December and gives his famous speech, and that's at the point in time in which he's making a push for Shokin to be fired. Then in January, there's two groups of parties from Ukraine that come out to Washington, D.C. Petro Poroshenko with his official entourage, and he meets directly with Biden. And I believe it's January 21st, 2016. And a group from NABU, which is the Ukraine's anti-corruption division, comes out and has a separate set of parallel meetings. And those are the meetings that Ciaramella is shepherding through Washington. And during these meetings, they actually say that they want to pick up as Shokin is being pushed out and Nabu's going to get the Burisma investigations with the intent to shut those down. They actually tell them that, hey, we'd like to kind of pick up those investigations and handle them ourselves. This is the FBI telling these prosecutors. Now, that ultimately kind of went back and forth and sort of ended up getting shuttered. But part of these same discussions was the FBI was setting up an on-site office at NABU's headquarters, and they kept it. They won't. That memorandum of agreement for the establishment of that FBI office has never been seen. They went to court to prevent it from being exposed. So, this is when they're creating kind of, and again, Ciaramella is part of it, is that Eric is shepherding this meeting. This is when they're setting up the structure for the cover-up of what Biden was now implementing. And it's very clear as you watch events play out through the rest of 2016, including a topic which I'm sure we'll get to, which is NABU got a hold of the infamous Black Ledger, which was used to shove out Manafort, and NABU leaked that and brought that forth 6 months later in June 2016. All of that's connected, and Ciaramella runs through all of that.
Right. Yeah, that's what I kind of alluded to earlier. And I think that part was completely missing from the sort of discussion this week when this whole topic, the Ciaramella ties to the Biden corruption issue, when that kind of came up again. The Black Ledger is so important. And the other thing that ties in with that, which is so important, is Nalyvaichenko, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, who later admitted that the Ukrainians deliberately interfered in the 2016 election. The thing we're not supposed to say, the thing that's, it's like COVID's origin, can't talk about it, didn't happen that way. Well, it did happen that way.
Yeah.
So I think just to fast forward a bit, and then we'll come back and talk in more detail about the ledger and how that ties in with everything, because again, I don't think that's been kind of covered at all this week. If we fast forward, so Ciaramella is there, he's chaperoning these guys. These guys are told that Joker needs to go. Now it's sort of kind of reaching other people. Before that, Biden just told Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, you need to fire this guy. It's a private conversation. No one else knew in Ukraine. And no one expected it in Ukraine. And Andriy Telizhenko actually told us that the entire Ukrainian delegation, of which he was a part, right? He was the honest one who told us what happened. They were completely shell-shocked because Shokin wasn't seen as a problem. Shokin was sort of the opposite of a problem. He's trying to create, clean up problems, and suddenly they're being told that getting a new loan is dependent on Shokin getting fired. And Ciaramella, again, he chaperoned it. He was there the whole time. He shepherded the whole process. Okay, he was on the plane with Biden on that infamous trip in December of 2015 that you mentioned. He was on that plane when Biden decided we're going to, get this prosecutor fired. He was probably directly involved in sort of conversations as to that. There's even a photo of them on the plane. Among, very few people, that he was directly involved with that, and he knew why, and he knew the background. There was even a story back in the New York Times at the time, when they were still like sort of semi-journalistic. You remember when they put out this story in December of 2015 about Hunter Biden's corruption with the energy firm, and that he worked there and had no experience, and why was he there, and why were they paying him $1 million? They would never dare ask these questions now, but they did back in December 2015.
Well,
so he was aware of all those
just
things.
Just to digress, that New York Times story may have been the genesis for the sudden phone call that took place. Burisma was holding their board meeting in Dubai, and Hunter and Devin Archer were present with Zlochevsky and Vadim Pizarski, the CFO. And that's when they had their meeting where Zlochevsky and Pizarski said, hey, you need to call your dad. And Hunter literally called, Joe Biden on the fly. And a big part of the motivation for that call was the sudden understanding that, hey, oh my gosh, New York Times is gearing up to do a story. We're getting phone calls. The New York Times is going to be doing a story about Hunter's position on our board. So, there was that other element, but that was really one of the genesises for that call with Joe Biden. And then what we saw was the vice president's camp, Joe Biden's back, kind of administrative up, higher echelon, all began to prepare for the New York Times, preparing a whole list of questions, and then preparing a secondary list of questions for other reporters whom they assumed were going to be asking them a bunch of questions, including, what's your position on Zlochevsky? Do you believe him to be corrupt? With a canned answer of, I don't really, we don't have an opinion on Zlochevsky, et cetera. But they drafted a whole preamble of Q&As for Joe Biden in preparation for this.
Yeah, they did. And again, it's just it's kind of mind-boggling thinking back about all that corruption and everything that was going on at the time. Okay, and then so you're Eric Ciaramella, you know all these things, you know how corrupt and how bad the whole thing was. You know, most importantly of all, you know that there was no U.S. government policy to fire this guy. It did not exist. And by the way, this excuse that they all kind of keep repeating all the time, oh, the IMF wanted to fire him, and the World Bank and the EU, everyone wanted to fire him. Well, Jeff, you and I did a lot of research on that. We went into the archives, we went into any and everything, and there was no evidence of that whatsoever. The only time when any of these organizations said anything at all, by the way, none of them ever mentioned Shokin by name. The only time they ever said anything about, oh, corruption or whatever was way after Joe Biden decided to fire the prosecutor. Okay, so you're Ciaramella, you know all that. Fast forward 2 years, you're on a phone call. By the way, the idea that the president of the United States can be on a call with a foreign leader, and there's 25 of these latte sipping laptop idiots, Washington D.C., master's degree from Georgetown kind of people on the call listening in. It's turning out to be a very frustrating show just thinking about that. So this guy's listening in, along with Vindman, another one, and of course the alarm bells go off because suddenly he's like, no, this is not good. We don't want Trump looking into that because he knows what happened. He was there. He was part of it.
Mm-hmm. The whole idea, things you mentioned about there being surprise to Shokin's firing, and I think that's true of Petro Poroshenko. I think with Nabu and Artem Sitnik, the head of Nabu, that's a little different. He had already been working with the FBI. From what we can gather, he had a little bit of prep there, and already had begun to put things into place. And I just want to mention something that drives me nuts that people don't pay enough attention to it, is that in February of 2016, so right after the Nabu officials and Poroshenko had come out to D.C., met with Biden, kind of plans are in place. FBI wanted to take over the Burisma investigation, got told no. Latvia comes in and tells Ukraine, hey, we have credible allegations of money laundering by Hunter Biden, Devon Archer, and 2 other Americans affiliated with Burisma. Ukraine and Nabu sat on and killed those allegations, and they went nowhere. Who was working with Nabu at the time? The FBI. So, getting back to this idea that 2 years later, Eric Ciaramella sits up in his seat and goes, oh my God, we have potentially a huge problem. Everything we work so hard to cover up could be coming out right in front of our eyes. That's all of what was transpiring. So, it's this larger story that what really was going on when Eric Ciaramella became this designated whistleblower that ultimately led to Trump's impeachment. No, what he was doing is he's the cover-up guy. He's the cleanup guy. He recognized that they were about to have a major, major problem, that everything they'd worked so hard to kind of cover up and sweep under the rug was potentially going to get exposed. How do they stop that? They had to stop Trump. And that's what Ciaramella put into action. Now, he didn't do it alone. He did it with the help of, it appears I.G. Atkinson. We still haven't seen the transcript of that. Here's a guy who created special rules to allow Ciaramella to be this whistleblower out of nowhere. Vindman steps in, the Vindman brothers step into the process. But everything that led to Trump's impeachment, it's just important that people remember, everything that led to Trump's impeachment sprung out of that phone call simply because they realized they were potentially about to be exposed and they had to take whatever action they had to take to keep that from happening. That's why Trump was impeached. That's why you and I keep saying that Trump was impeached for Biden's crimes.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there's so much parallelism going on there. Biden leveraged U.S. taxpayer funds to get the prosecutor fired. That means to protect his son. That means to cover up corruption. Biden leveraged U.S. taxpayer money in order to advance corruption. That's as short as I can put it, and that's 100% true.
Yep.
Trump then leveraged U.S. taxpayer money to unearth the corruption. It's like it's parallel, but it's the inverse. It's just completely unreal what's going on there. And yet, I think this is so, this is just not understood. And so coming back to where we, started off, on the whole, even though it's frustrating, it took 4 years, and the stuff like the yikes email and all the stuff we talked about, everything that we talked about has been out there for at least 4 years. But hey, I'm happy it's out. Now, we did want to come back to one issue, which I don't think was covered this week, which is the connections between all of that and other actions of the Ukrainians, including other actions, including the people, involved in the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, as well as, of course, Ciaramella. And so on the one hand, you've got the Black Ledger issue. And I think on the other hand, we need to talk about Nalyvaichenko, the head of Ukrainian intelligence at the time in 2015, 16, and so on. Why don't we start with the Black Ledger? So I don't think it's appreciated enough how much, and you alluded to it earlier with Russiagate. Oh, Russia interfered in the 2016 election. No, they did not. The country that interfered, if any country by the way, one hit piece on 60 Minutes is worth 1,000 times foreign interference. But okay, let's leave that aside, just in terms of the audience and the reach and all that kind of stuff. But let's leave that aside. If anyone interfered in the 2016 election, it's Ukraine. And this is not just us saying this. This is documented. Widely documented again, but it's just not reported. So the whole Black Ledger operation is an effort to oust Trump's campaign manager. He started off as the convention manager and became campaign manager, Paul Manafort. Now, Paul Manafort, in my view, is a shady character, and he was involved with a lot of shady people over the years. He had this consultancy and kind of just a DC insider, kind of, not my cup of tea. Let me just put it that way. Fine, whatever. That doesn't mean you have to target him in order to influence an election. And yet that is exactly what the Ukrainians did, because they dug up this so-called Black Ledger, which apparently showed that there were cash payments to Manafort sort of under the table in respect of advising one of the Ukrainian political parties. I mean, Yanukovych and whatever. We don't have to get into that right now. And it was the release of that Black Ledger in August of 2016 that caused Trump, in my view, very wisely, and I wish he had followed that advice kind of more over the subsequent years. Well, he basically fired Manafort on the spot, even though there wasn't any truth to it. And as it turns out, the Black Ledger was fake. The Ukrainians just faked it in order to damage Trump because they wanted Hillary, hence the election interference. But the reason why I say that I think Trump acted wisely is, imagine if he hadn't done that in August of 2016. He'd have been stuck for the next 2 months, leading up into the election, which was close enough as it was, right? Every day with, Manafort, he took a bribe, Russia, and, all that kind of stuff. By the way, it had nothing to do with Russia. It was Ukraine. That's the other thing that frustrates me so much. How, Manafort and the Russiagate, how many people actually know it had nothing to do with Russia? He was advising a Ukrainian political party. But okay, leaving all that aside, Trump fired him. And in a way, at least, he shut down that discussion. So for the remaining 2 months of the campaign, there wasn't, any more, not much, or at least not much about Manafort. But what the Ukrainians did is they kept going. They had their prime minister go on Facebook and call Trump all kinds of names and say, he can't be prime minister. He couldn't possibly become prime minister. I think they had their foreign minister do something similar. They had the ambassador.
The ambassador wrote an article
in Washington, D.C. Valerie Chaly wrote an article saying, that basically Trump is trash and don't vote for this guy. This is unheard of. This is simply unheard of. You do not have an ambassador of a foreign country putting their thumbs on the scale in the middle of an election campaign. It just doesn't happen. Yet the Ukrainians did it. And I think here's where we get to, I'll stop here in a moment, but I think the Politico piece shortly after the election, after Trump actually won, right, was so remarkable there was a political piece where again Ken Vogel tried to sort of clean things up for the Ukrainians, basically saying that the Ukrainians kind of felt bad for interfering. And here we come to the documentary evidence. The Ukrainians interfered, and it's in that article. It's not only, it's many other pieces of information, like what we just talked about, Valery Shally and the prime minister and Facebook and all that kind of stuff. But in that political article, there's Naly Vaichenko, the head of the Ukrainian kind of CIA, FBI. It's like, it's not quite the same thing, but the head of Ukrainian intelligence, who says, yeah, he actually says, of course, everyone knows we interfered in the 2016 election. He said that. That's a Ukrainian head of intelligence who says that in a Politico piece. All of that is buried, of course, nowadays.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to go back to the Black Ledger for a moment. First of all, it's important that people understand that the Black Ledger, the thing, this book of payments, has actually never been verified. And indeed now I think many people, myself included, think that it was fabricated. And, it's not to say that Manafort's a good guy. I agree with you. I think he's pretty shady. He was doing a lot of shady things. But he got taken out by a document that was put together probably by the Ukrainian Secret Service and then transferred to NABU. Now, we know factually it was transferred to NABU. How do we know this? Because none other than Nellie Orr, who was working for Fusion GPS, as far as I know, the earliest reference that I found on the Black Ledger goes back to May. And I'm talking about a domestic reference to the Black Ledger. And Nellie Orr had found a famous blogger in Ukraine, Odessa, who had just started talking about the Black Ledger and said he's aware of this ledger, the so-called Black Ledger, that had just been transferred to NABU's possession. And this is May 30th. And it details these payments. It implicates Manafort. Nellie Orr took this and sent this information into the DOJ on May 30th to her husband Bruce Orr, to Lisa Holton. There's one other that was included on that. Oh, Ivana Nitschitz and Joe Wheatley. And the subject line of her email was Ukrainian cash box. And so, again, think about what's going on. This information is coming from Ukraine. It's coming to Nellie. Nellie is then transmitting it into the DOJ at a very, relatively speaking, early date, May 30th, 2016. And from there, that slowly builds. Now, NABU doesn't actually release it, as you said, until August. I think they were timing it for maximum effect. What I'm trying to get to is the idea that this was actually very well planned, very well coordinated, and known about in advance. It didn't just drop out of the sky. Everything was being developed in the early months of 2016. NABU officially got their hands on it in May. They then figured out what was the best timing to expose this. The DOJ was aware of it, and then it all hits through the New York Times in August. And NABU was the one that released it to the New York Times. So, you see this highly coordinated effort, as you were talking about, between Ukrainian officials who were actively trying to influence the election and DOJ officials. I mean, that's what happened.
Right, and Ciaramella, right at the center of it, because again, he was the conduit between National Security Council and these NABU folks, these Ukrainians, the ones he hosted in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, I guess coming back to kind of the overall picture here, I hope what happened this week, the fact that this old story became a news story again, is going to move this process along in some way, because there is so much injustice in this story, and it just kind of behooves us all to somehow get some finality on it, because never mind the 50% of the country who will never get it because they just watch, CNN, but, at least get the other 50% to understand the essence of this story. And I think, this week has helped a lot in getting us there. Again, I said it earlier, I think the essence of this story is that two pieces of information, really. Number one, that the most conflicted person on the planet in respect of Biden corruption in Ukraine, because he was right at the center of it all, was also the person who caused Trump's first impeachment. I think that's the starting point. And I think the wider point, the more important point, the overarching point really is that Biden used his position as vice president, and he leveraged US taxpayer money to advance corruption. And Trump got impeached for trying to stop corruption. That's as simple as I can put it. That's what happened. We can prove it. We've discussed there's a lot more to discuss, but I think as good as we can, we've discussed, the main evidence here.
And this whole issue, like Ciaramella is the conduit, and how many times have we seen the person who's the conduit become the cleanup man? And that's exactly what happened with Ciaramella. Is he then was tasked with the job of, you got to find a way to clean up this mess. And the way to clean this up was to find a way to prevent Trump from doing any more digging. The simplest way to do that happened to just coincide and gel with what the DNC already wanted to do, and that was find a means to impeach Trump. One other thing it's worth noting here, a frequent target of ours, Dan Goldman, the congressman from New York. He was, at the time, he was the lead impeachment counsel for the DNC. So, if people wonder why Dan Goldman is always going on TV and acting as sort of this, almost like he's the Biden's personal lawyer, despite currently sitting in Congress, the reason he's doing that is as much for self-protection, self-interest, as it is to protect Biden or Obama. Because he was also intimately involved in the impeachment effort. He knew all of these details. Everything that we're telling you right now, Dan Goldman knows. There's even an email. I've tried any number of times to shame him into answering, of course, with not expecting him to, and he won't. But we know that Hunter Biden met with the impeachment lawyers. We're almost positive that he met directly with Dan Goldman. If he wasn't meeting directly with Dan Goldman during the Trump impeachment process, Hunter Biden was meeting with people directly under Dan Goldman, and Dan Goldman was given all of those details. We know this because there was a point in time where Hunter was being asked about something. He said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it. I've got to meet with the impeachment lawyers tomorrow." Well, the head of the impeachment lawyers is Dan Goldman. So he's equally tied up. He's playing Ciaramella is the fundamental cleanup guy. Dan Goldman, in his own rights, is sort of the secondary cover-up guy, covering up the elements around in the impeachment. Ciaramella enabled the impeachment. Goldman carried it out. They're each doing their own elements of cleanup. One thing before we maybe close this, is it worth, what do you think? Is it too detailed, or is it worth talking about Atkinson?
No, I think we should, absolutely, yeah.
Well, why don't you go? I mean, he's the guy that enabled Ciaramella to become a whistleblower. And famously, of all the transcripts that exist out there that you and I would really love to see, and I think most every Russiagate investigator would love to see, is the transcript of Michael Atkinson. And it's never come out, despite repeated requests. And why wouldn't the committee that's looking to impeach Biden, why hasn't that been released? It's astonishing to me. That would shed so much light on things.
You're absolutely right. And, just to digress for a moment, why haven't any of these COVID origin transcripts been released? After all, these are held by the GOP, they're in control of the House. They have these transcripts, but we haven't seen them. Where's the Daszak transcript? They've had it for the past 6 months. Where is it? Many others. But, I digress, because the Atkinson situation has been going on for much longer. Now, initially, so Atkinson was the Inspector General who had no authority over this complaint, this so-called whistleblower complaint from Ciaramella, because it just simply wasn't under, his umbrella. And in any case, Ciaramella did not comply with any of the existing rules as to being a whistleblower and being able to bring one of these complaints. So what Atkinson did is he changed the rules as he went along. And another friend of ours, Steve McIntyre, actually uncovered that because he dug up an archive. He's so fantastic at so many things, and this is one of them. He dug up the rule book governing these Inspector General complaints. And all of a sudden, in August of 2019, the rules were changed. Ooh, what do you know, right? And this was exactly
a week or
so after. Yeah, exactly. So he was then brought in for questioning, And this was in a Democrat-led House, and so the Schiff and so on. So the excuse was always, well, it hasn't been released because Trump couldn't release it because it was in the legislative branch of government, not the executive. He had no authority. Okay, fine. And you and I mean, I can go back years and years and years that I've been tweeting about this. Please release the transcript. When Republicans finally get control of the House, please release the transcript. Well, they finally did after the 2022 midterms. And I was screaming it from the rooftops, like, okay, first thing you guys should do, very first thing is please release the transcript, because we've never seen it. This is from 2019. And it would answer questions about what we just talked about, changing the rules. Why did Atkinson suddenly feel he's responsible for an area that's not under his purview? And on and on. There's so much stuff there. What was his involvement? Who was controlling him? Who was telling him what to do? Why was he doing all these things? Why did he leave shortly after? And what were the people he was working with? There were a couple of we don't have time to get into all those details, but there's a couple of people working with Atkinson who also came up later elsewhere. It's always this Washington D.C. carousel thing. Anyway, where's the transcript? And so we've been waiting, and periodically we've been saying, where is it? And we still don't have it. So McCarthy, no. And this useless guy now, Johnson, no. And we'll probably never see it. It's as if there's sort of certain lines that these DC people never ever cross. And I think we saw it with Johnson, that he was about to maybe cross it with, maybe we shouldn't fund Ukraine. Then he was called into some, classified briefing, and all of a sudden he's like, no, it's fine. We'll do whatever you want, I don't know if I'm being cynical here, but I kind of think they just give them the tapes of whatever these guys have done badly, bad stuff they've done over their lives, like the J. Edgar Hoover book, like, here you go. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's
as soon as that happens, they're all like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I could be wrong, but I don't think we mentioned it. Atkinson, we said he's the Inspector General. I don't think we said what he is the Inspector General of. And just to make sure that everybody knows, he's the Inspector General for the intelligence community. So let that sink in. And I think fundamentally, if you want to cut to the chase, that's why his transcript hasn't been released, because he was the Inspector General of the intelligence community. He was involved in enabling Ciaramella to initiate the impeachment of Trump. And it's a double-sided coin. That's why we so badly want to see his transcript. And that's the same reason why his transcript hasn't been revealed.